Deep within the cold-choked mountains of Appalachia lies a place where even the bravest hunters refuse to tread. Locals call it Devil's Vein, a ravine of black stone and suffocating mist. They say the land itself feels wrong there, as if the air presses down on you, heavy and watchful. But what made Devil's Vein infamous wasn't the rocks, or the fog, or the mines that collapsed long ago. It was the family who claimed that land, the Mercers. The Mercer family's story begins in the early 1900s, when Ezekiel Mercer, a coal miner, survived a collapse that killed dozens of men. When rescuers finally pulled him from the wreckage, he was delirious, muttering about voices in the stone, about shadows that fed him in the dark. Ezekiel was never the same. He refused to return to the mines, and moved his wife and children into a rotting cabin above Devil's Vein. There, the Mercers began their descent into horror. Ezekiel's obsession with the voices grew. He carved strange symbols into the walls of the cabin, and forbade his children from mingling with townsfolk, claiming outsiders carried the poison of the surface. Over time, the Mercers turned inward, marrying only among themselves, their bloodline growing more warped with each generation. By the 1930s, locals whispered about the family's deformities, too close together. Limbs that bent at impossible angles, skin so pale it seemed translucent. But deformity alone didn't terrify the region. It was the Mercers' appetite. Livestock began vanishing from farms near Devil's Vein: cows, pigs, even dogs. When a group of boys stumbled onto the Mercer cabin in 1934, they found the skins of animals hanging from the rafters, but no bones. The Mercers, it seemed, weren't just killing livestock, they were consuming everything, down to the marrow. And then people began to vanish. The first was a traveling salesman, whose wagon was found abandoned near the ravine, his wares scattered in the dirt. Then a pair of young lovers, last seen hiking near Devil's Vein. Later, a deputy sheriff, who went to investigate and never returned. Each time, the Mercers denied involvement. But hunters reported hearing screams in the night, cut short by grotesque laughter. Others swore they saw pale figures crouched along the ridge, watching with hungry eyes. By the late 1930s, a survivor finally told the truth. A young girl, barely 16, was found wandering half-mad on the road, her clothes soaked in blood. She claimed she'd been dragged into the Mercer home after her family's car broke down near the ravine. Inside, she saw horrors that would haunt her forever. A long wooden table covered in bones, skulls stacked in the corners, and Mercer children gnawing on human limbs as casually as if they were roasted meat. She described Ezekiel, now elderly, leading the family in chants, his face smeared with blood, his voice rasping, "The stone feeds, and so we feed." The girl escaped when a fight broke out among the family members, giving her a chance to flee into the woods. But what she saw convinced the townsfolk. The Mercers were not just reclusive. They were cannibals, worshippers of something that lived beneath Devil's Vein. Lawmen tried to intervene, but Devil's Vein worked against them. The ravine was filled with caves, tunnels, and collapsed mine shafts that the Mercers knew better than anyone. Attempts to raid their cabin often ended with ambush deputies dragged screaming into the mist, only to be found later, torn apart and heften. More than once, officers reported hearing chanting echo through the stone, as if dozens of voices were singing from within the rock itself. By the 1940s, the Mercer reputation had spread far beyond Appalachia. Newspapers sensationalized them as the cannibals of Devil's Vein, describing them as a clan of subterranean predators who dragged their victims into the earth. Travelers were warned to stay clear of the hollows, and some families abandoned nearby towns entirely. But the Mercers didn't just survive off fear, they thrived on it. Survivors described grotesque rituals where the family gathered in caves, lit only by oil lamps. Victims were bound, bled, and butchered on stone altars, carved with spirals and jagged symbols. The Mercers believed these offerings fed the voices Ezekiel first heard in the mines, that the stone itself was alive, and that through blood, they could join with it. And as each generation passed, the Mercers seemed less and less human. Their bodies twisted, their eyes grew sunken and luminous, and their movements turned animalistic. Some claim they began to walk on all fours, scuttling like pale crabs through the tunnels. Others swore their voices grew deeper, rumbling like the stone itself. The Mercer family was no longer just a clan. They were something else entirely. Something born from the dark veins of the mountain. Something that fed, and waited, and grew. And if you stand at the mouth of Devil's Vein on a moonless night, some say you can still hear them. The scraping of claws on stone, the muffled cries of prey dragged into the earth. And beneath it all, a low, inhuman chant rising from the blackness. The stone feeds, and so we feed. By the 1950s, the Mercer family had become a whispered nightmare across Appalachia. Parents warned children never to wander near Devil's Vein. Travelers who lost their way would rather sleep in the open woods than approach the Mercers' land. But fear only seemed to make the clans stronger, and their atrocities grew more elaborate and more public. The first major incident came in 1952, when a group of miners, attempting to reopen an abandoned shaft near Devil's Vein, went missing. Their families reported them overdue, and search parties scoured the ridge. What they found still haunts locals to this day. The miners' bodies arranged in a perfect circle, deep inside the shaft, each man's chest torn open, ribs cracked outward, like grotesque wings. At the center of the circle lay a massive stone, slick with blood, covered in spiral carvings no one could identify. Scratched into the wall beside it were the words, "The stone feeds." Lawmen attempted to storm the Mercer homestead shortly afterward, but the family was ready. Accounts from that raid read more like tales of war than rural policing. Deputies reported being ambushed by pale, howling figures leaping from the trees. Their movements animal-like, their eyes glowing in lamplight. One officer swore he saw a Mercer child tear into a man's throat with her teeth, smiling as blood soaked her face. Of the dozen officers who entered Devil's Vein, only 4 made it out alive. The others vanished into the tunnels, their screams echoing through the dark. It was around this time that the clan's matriarch, known only as Grandmother Mercy, rose to prominence. Survivors described her as skeletal, her face a twisted mask of folds and scars, her spine bent at a grotesque angle. She carried a staff tipped with a human jawbone, and was always surrounded by children, dozens of them. Most malformed, their features twisted by generations of inbreeding. Witnesses claimed she spoke with the voice of the stone itself, a low, vibrating growl that shook the air around her. She told her family that they were not human anymore, that they had been chosen by the veins of the earth to be its servants, its feeders. The Mercers began building deeper into the caves beneath their cabin, carving out chambers with their bare hands and crude tools. When explorers later stumbled upon these tunnels, they reported walls smeared with blood, bones arranged into spiral mosaics, and alcoves where shriveled bodies were wedged into the rock, mouths frozen in silent screams. These weren't just kill sites, they were shrines. The Mercers had turned the caves into temples for their stone god. Disappearances escalated. Families traveling through the region would vanish overnight, their abandoned wagons found with claw marks gouged into the wood. Hunters discovered piles of bones in the forest, stripped clean of flesh, arranged in careful patterns. In 1959, an entire church congregation disappeared while on a revival trip near Devil's Vein. Their belongings were later discovered in a cave chamber, stacked neatly around an altar of skulls. Not a single body was ever recovered by the early 1960s. Whispers spread that the Mercers were no longer fully human. Some survivors described them as pale, eyeless things that crawled along cave ceilings like insects. Others swore they saw Mercer figures melting into the shadows of the tunnels, their forms shifting as if the stone itself was consuming them. There were even tales of voices, dozens at once, chanting in perfect unison from deep below the ground, vibrating so powerfully that the rock itself seemed to tremble. What terrified people most wasn't just their brutality, it was their patience. The Mercers weren't reckless. They planned, they stalked, they lured. Travelers often reported hearing faint cries for help in the woods, only to discover they'd been tricked. The voice was nothing but a recording or a child's mimicry, designed to lure the kind-hearted into ambushes. By the time help arrived, the victims were gone, dragged into the veins. The state eventually declared Devil's Vein uninhabitable, fencing it off and posting signs warning of toxic gas from old coal shafts. But locals knew the truth. The signs weren't for gas, they were for the Mercers. Still, thrill-seekers couldn't resist. Some entered the hollow with cameras, hoping to capture proof of the clan. A handful returned with footage, pale figures crouched in trees, eyes reflecting light like animals, strange spiral carvings still fresh on cave walls, bones scattered across the floor of tunnels. Most who entered, though, never came back at all. And then, sometime in the late 1960s, the Mercer homestead burned to the ground. Witnesses reported seeing flames rising over Devil's Vein, the sound of shrieking voices carried on the wind. When authorities finally braved the area days later, they found only smoldering ruins. No bodies, no bones, no remains. It was as though the family had vanished into the earth. But Devil's Vein didn't fall silent. Travelers still vanished. Hunters still found fresh spirals carved into trees. And deep in the caves, explorers swore they heard breathing, not the breath of a man or animal, but of the mountain itself, a deep rumble that grew louder the deeper they went. The Mercer family might have lost their cabin, but their hunger endured, and if the whispers are true, they no longer need a home above ground. They have one below, carved into the black stone, stretching deeper than anyone dares to imagine. Asterisk, if the Mercer clan truly disappeared, when their homestead burned in the 1960s, then the terror of Devil's Vein should have ended with them. But for those who lived near the hollow, the horror never stopped, it only changed. The Mercers might have shed their cabin, their tools, even their names, but the hunger that defined them still echoes in the black stone beneath Appalachia. By the 1980s, Devil's Vein had become a forbidden destination for thrill-seekers and researchers chasing the Mercer legend. Locals told them not to go, but some ignored the warnings. Many never returned. Those who did came back with stories more unsettling than anything written in the old newspapers. One explorer, in 1984, described stumbling upon a cavern deep below the ravine where the walls seemed alive. He swore the stone itself pulsed like muscle, veins of red glowing faintly within. Embedded in the walls were bones, hundreds of them half swallowed by rock, as if the mountain had eaten the bodies whole. Worse, he claimed he saw pale shapes moving within the stone, human-like figures trapped and writhing just beneath the surface, mouths open in silent screams. He left the cave broken, muttering the same words Ezekiel Mercer once repeated: "The stone feeds." In the 1990s, hikers reported seeing strange fires burning in the ravine at night. When locals investigated, they found circles of ash and spirals carved into the earth, fresh despite decades of supposed abandonment. Some claimed to hear faint chanting carried on the wind, dozens of voices rising and falling in unison. Those who stayed too long said the ground itself vibrated beneath their feet, as though something massive shifted deep below. Perhaps the most disturbing modern account came in 2003, when a group of spelunkers entered one of the collapsed mine shafts connected to Devil's Vein. They never returned, but their camera was recovered months later, wedged between rocks. The footage showed the group laughing at first, their headlamps cutting through the dark. Then, hours in, their tone shifted. One by one, they claimed to hear whispers, not echoes, but voices, speaking directly to them. The final minutes of the recording are pure chaos screams, the camera shaking violently, glimpses of pale limbs crawling along the ceiling, The last frame froze on a spiral carved into the rock wall, slick with blood that appeared fresh. To this day, Devil's Vein remains cordoned off, officially labeled unstable terrain, but locals know better. Hunters swear they've seen pale figures crouched in trees, their eyes reflecting like animals. Drivers on the old mining roads report sudden shapes darting in front of their cars, followed by the sound of claws scraping against the metal. And then there are the disappearances, too many to ignore, always near the ravine, always without explanation. Folklorists argue that the Mercer legend is more than a tale of cannibalism. The spirals carved into stone match ancient symbols found in petroglyphs across Appalachia, believed by indigenous peoples to represent portals or living spirits within the earth. What if Ezekiel Mercer wasn't insane when he heard voices in the mines? What if he really did make contact with something ancient, something that had slumbered beneath the coal veins for centuries? If that's true, then the Mercer family were never just cannibals. They were disciples. They fed on flesh because the stone demanded it. And when their bodies broke down after generations of inbreeding, they didn't die. They merged with the very mountain they worshipped. That would explain the voices, the pale figures in the caves, the breathing some explorers swear rises from beneath the earth. Skeptics dismiss it all as folklore. But they can't explain the patterns of missing people. They can't explain the fresh spirals carved into rock walls, or the recordings of voices too deep for any human throat. They can't explain why, on moonless nights, travelers hear a rumbling in the ground that sounds like 1,000 breaths rising in unison. The Mercer family may not walk the surface anymore, but their horror lingers. They are the stone now. They are the hollow. And if you ever stand at the edge of Devil's Vein, alone and in silence, listen closely, because the Mercers might still be listening. And when the stone feeds, it always demands more. The Mercer family's story doesn't end with fire or with bones left in a hollow. If the whispers are true, their bloodline fused with something older, something buried deep in the veins of Appalachia itself. That means the Mercers didn't vanish. They adapted. Some say you can still feel them in the earth, still hear their chants in the caves, still see their spirals carved fresh into stone. And maybe, just maybe, the Mercers are no longer just a family, but a living hunger that spreads beneath these mountains. But the Mercer line is only one piece of Appalachia's nightmare. There are other clans, other legacies, and other horrors buried in the hollows. So if you dare to keep going deeper with me, hit subscribe, ring the bell, and tell me in the comments, would you step into Devil's Vein for even a moment, or would you never set foot near those cursed rocks? Remember, Appalachia keeps its secrets, and sometimes those secrets keep feeding.